talk will run approximately 40 minutes, just in case anyone's wondering if I'm ever going to finish, so you can set your, sort of set your watches. Okay, for the organization of the talk, it will begin, we'll begin with a brief look at the scope of cultural linguistics. We'll then do a historical overview of the path taken by cognitive linguistics over the past 30 years. We'll compare and contrast then in the next section features and concerns of cognitive linguistics and cultural linguistics. Then we will look at some challenges and suggestions that I personally have for cultural linguistics, and hopefully there'll be a bit of time set aside at the end for discussion of the conference and future directions. The diagram that you see to the left is one that you're all familiar with. It talks about the relationship, or the various ways that you can look at cultural linguistics. I think you're all familiar with that. As reflected in the diagram, various features and levels of language, from the morphosyntactic to pragmatic and semantic meanings, may be embedded in cultural conceptualizations in the form of cultural schemas, cultural categories, and cultural metaphors. Another diagram that I'm sure you've all seen, which shows the multidisciplinary dimensions intrinsic to the framework of cultural linguistics. We see the points of intersection of the subdisciplines at the top. We see the overlapping circles, which feature the common ground between the various theoretical disciplines. And we note that the model is designed not so much to set forth the borders of the discipline as to make them more porous, particularly toward culturally informed cognitive insights and analytical tools that can be drawn from other subdisciplines which make up what today is understood globally as the cognitive sciences. In 1996, Gary Palmer produced a diagram that you see there that I believe in retrospect was overly optimistic in terms of how cognitive linguistics was actually going to develop. What I hope to show in this talk is that over the past 20 years, since Gary put out this diagram, the distance between the core concepts and concerns of the two fields, namely cognitive linguistics and cultural linguistics, has varied significantly. As we'll see in what follows, it is the cultural component that was sidelined by adherence to the model of embodied realism set forth by Lakoff and Johnson. However, I will argue that culture is now making a comeback in cognitive linguistics. The argument that I'll be making in favor of cultural linguistics is a relatively simple one. I allege that despite its successes, and there have been many, over the past 30 years, the field of cognitive linguistics has followed a circular path, leading from what initially promised to be a relatively strong, culturally oriented research paradigm to an increasingly different, individualistic, neurally embedded or embodied one, and that currently the field is moving back again, trying to regain lost ground. I'll argue that over the years, in cognitive linguistics, the hardening of the model, the distancing from any kind of languocultural grounding, has resulted in the partial or full rejection of the core tenets of the embodiment theory by an increasing number of researchers. I'll argue that the initial distancing process was caught up in and coupled to the changing contours of the dominant paradigms in cognitive science, most particularly the initial shift away from classical cognitivism to an embodied and an activist perspective. That today we find attempts to execute what has been called a social turn in the field of cognitive linguistics, a broader initiative called social cognitive linguistics, which has a distinct linguocultural emphasis. In short, increasingly we hear calls for cognitive linguistics to go outside the head and incorporate a social interactional perspective on the nature of language. Let me begin by saying that I recognize that cognitive linguistics is not a completely homogeneous enterprise, that over the past 30 years the field has changed in terms of its emphasis, theory, and methods, and that the submodels which make it up are not identical or always fully commensurate. That my comments here are generalities, and ones that reflect my own personal bias with respect to what I feel are the weaknesses inherent in cognitive linguistics. While the field has undergone changes, it is an enterprise that shares a certain core set of theoretical commitments, ones that have remained relatively constant, and these will be our focus, at least initially, as well as the debates that have risen over their appropriateness and empirical validity. This diagram, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, it is a diagram that shows the various cognitive sciences as of 1991. It appeared in a work called The Embodied Mind by Varela, Thompson, and Roche. This is a work we'll talk about a little bit later, one of the groundbreaking works that opened up the second generation of cognitive science, a work that continues today to be cited over and over again. You look at this diagram, you see that it's a polar map, and you can see that they set forth 3 stages for the 25-year period, or from 25 years ago. The first is classical cognitivism, which is in the center, and of course you see the name of Chomsky, representing the linguistics philosophy component. Then you have a second circle, which is listed as emergence, and a third circle, which is listed as enactivism. Today, we would put the second and the third circles together, and they would be called the second generation of cognitive science. You notice the names in the outer frame of Lakoff under linguistics and Johnson under philosophy, which means that Thompson, or Varela, Thompson, and Roche already were citing the work of those 2 authors, and we will look at that in more detail. My thesis is the following, that a paradigm doesn't evolve in isolation, but rather draws its strength and power to convince from adjacent fields. This process of paradigm consolidation often involves investigators from one field seeking to justify and ground their findings in those of another. Today, cognitive linguistics is considered by many to be one of the principal branches of second-generation cognitive science, an alliance of new approaches emerging from what has been called the second cognitive revolution of the last decades of the 20th century. If you recall, the diagram we just looked at came from 1991. But there's a problem with this assertion or assumption that cognitive linguistics should be considered one of the principal branches of the second-generation cognitive science. Examine more closely the model of embodied mind by Varela, Thompson, and Roche from 91, republished in 93, that was embraced by those working in second-generation cognitive science, is in fact far closer to the model of cultural linguistics than to the model of experiential realism promoted eventually by Lakoff and Johnson, namely the paradigm of neural embodiment that has dominated much of the work in the field of cognitive linguistics for the past 30 years. I will argue that cultural linguistics is more aligned with the notion of embodied mind put forward by Varela and Thompson and Roche, with their emphasis on the cultural when talking about the body-mind-world complex, and that consequently cultural linguistics is more aligned with the tenets and findings of complexity science. I'll argue that second generation cognitive science described by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, keep in mind these are like the founders of the notion of the embodied mind, actually stand in opposition to the Lakovian model of neural embodiment. Finally, that terms such as inaction and embodied, when used by Varela, Thompson, and Roach, meant something quite different from what Lakoff and Johnson came to defend as embodied realism. Nevertheless, the set of terms resonated strongly with each other across the disciplines. This shows a period of approximately 25, 30 years. We look at the bottom, and you can see in 1980, a work by Matarellana and Varela, Autopoiesis and Cognition, was published. It was a very important work. Same year that Metaphors We Live By was published. In 1987, The Tree of Knowledge, Maturana and Varela, same year that the works by Lakoff and Johnson came out. In 1991, you had The Embodied Mind, which was the book I cited before as being the groundbreaking book that still today appears over and over again, cited by those working in the field of embodiment. And that year, you have Lakoff coming up with the contemporary theory of metaphor, where he begins to harden his position. Right? In 1999, we have An Embodied Cognitive Science by Clark, another important work. Same year that Philosophy in the Flesh came out. But again, in Philosophy in the Flesh, you begin to see this hardening of the position that Lakoff and Johnson have. In 2002, we still are running across the same words, situated in embodiment, or talking about cognition as situated, about it being embodied. And this came out in a special issue of Cognitive Systems Research that was edited by Tom Zemke. And we find, on the other hand, the same year, why cognitive linguistics requires embodied realism. In other words, it's now being imposed as the paradigm theory for all of cognitive linguistics. In 2007, we have Jaegers and DePaulo's work, Participatory Self-Making, an Inactive Approach to Social Cognition. And the same year, we see a further divergence away from the cultural. If you're familiar with the article, The Neural Theory of Metaphor, you realize that this is when the position really and truly hardened. So we'll take a stroll down memory lane, a short one. In 2004, Kohler speaks of classical cognitive metaphor theory as articulated, for example, in Lakoff and Johnson from 1980, and epitomized by the following quote referring to experientialism, which is found in Metaphors We Live By. The nature of our bodies and our physical and cultural environment imposes a structure on our experience. And he goes on to talk about how this goes from one domain to another. So in 1980, what did Lakoff and Johnson mean by the term experience? Investigators have cited the fundamental importance of the following assertion by Lakoff and Johnson, taken from the same work, 1980, which seems to be contradicted by other statements about experiential realism in that volume as well as in subsequent ones. In other words, what we call direct physical experience is never merely a matter of having a body of a certain sort. Rather, every experience takes place within a vast background of cultural presuppositions. It can be misleading, therefore, to speak of direct physical experience as though there were some core of immediate experience which we then interpret in terms of our conceptual system. Conceptual cultural assumptions, values, and attitudes are not a conceptual overlay which we may or may not place upon experience when we choose. It would be more correct to say that all experience is cultural through and through, that we experience our world in such a way that our culture is already present in the very experience itself. I would emphasize that it was precisely these last statements, taken to be typical of the model of Lakoff and Johnson, which were integrated by Varela, Thompson, and Roach into their own definitions of inaction and embodied cognition. And they cite the work of Lakoff and Johnson in their own work, which is also one of the reasons why Lakoff and Johnson became part of the embodied mind paradigm. They were validated by Varela, Thompson, and Roche. On the other hand, we should not underestimate the importance of the work by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, whose full title was The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science, and Human Experience, and its role in shaping the Lakoff and Johnson enterprise. A bit of history. Keeping in mind Lakoff's relationship with Berkeley, we find that Varela and Thompson wrote their book in conjunction with Roche, who at the time was teaching and doing research at Berkeley in both cognitive psychology and Buddhist philosophy. Indeed, much of the work was done while the three of them were in Berkeley, where they continued the dialogue between the cognitive sciences and the Buddhist tradition, as they state in the preface to their work. And they were in contact with Professor Lakoff. On the other hand, Philosophy in the Flesh from 1999 is a work where the concept of embodied mind and experience, as eventually redefined by Lakoff and Johnson, are laid out. The term experiential realism is launched, and the earlier background of cultural presuppositions is essentially abandoned. We should recall that those earlier definitions are the ones that had been appropriated by Varela, Thompson, and Roche to elaborate their own theory of embodied mind. And in 1999, we find this statement by Lakoff and Johnson. They've already moved on, right? We owe a special debt to Evan Thompson, Francisco Varela, Eleanor Roche, whose extensive work on embodied cognition has been inspirational and informed our thinking throughout, more or less. Then you have the following. These are the core concepts that eventually were assigned by Lakoff and Johnson to embodiment theory, or the so-called embodiment postulate. We find claims that pre-linguistic cognitive structure and the cognitive unconscious ground linguistic meaning, and hence are the bedrock of language. There are claims that the connection between two conceptual domains is not arbitrary. It does not occur in the absence of or separately from the contents of pre- or extra-linguistic experience. It is motivated by the metaphoric elaboration of image schematic pre-conceptual structures. In short, the tenets of embodied realism set forth a research agenda in which language data and conceptualization serve as evidence for the universal and pre-cultural nature of cognition and construal. To justify their terminology, this is a quote from Polowuk from 2013. To justify their terminology, namely embodied realism, Lakoff and Johnson postulate a literal preconceptual level of sensory motor interactions with the world. Such basic concepts are extended metaphorically and made available in various portions depending on the culture. When evaluating the role by the experientialist postulate, conceptual metaphor theory and its entailments, Sina notes that we should try not to lose sight of the dialogic content of theories, the fact that they are rhetorical as well as cognitive constructions, engaged both collaboratively and competitively with other rhetorical constructions. Johnson and Lakoff have, with increasing emphasis, deployed a rhetorical style, emphasizing the raising of the foundations of the edifices of past ages, the consignment of almost the entire canon of Western thought to the dustbin of history, prehistory, and starting again from the ground up. Leaving aside the building metaphor, Johnson and Lakoff's message is couched in the terms of a rhetoric of discovery and discontinuity. There's a downside to this rhetoric, of course, because it downplays continuity and affiliation. And as many have noticed, Lakoff and Johnson knocked down many straw men of their own making. Look at the dangers of disciplinary border crossings. All right, you have. We've looked at earlier at the diagram, which you saw these words being repeated over and over again: embodied, situated, embodiment, etc. Right. by carefully choosing their terminology so that it resonated across disciplinary boundaries, experientialism, experiential realism, and embodied realism, that is, using terms that were already popular and familiar to those working in the cognitive sciences. Lakoff and Johnson created a paradigm that would receive a warm welcome back in the early 1990s. That warm reception was brought about not simply because of the similarity of the terminology used, but because of the way that the premises of Lakoff and Johnson, as expressed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, resonated with the embodied mind model being developed in the cognitive sciences. And that model included the notion that direct physical experience is never merely a matter of having a body of a certain sort. Rather, every experience takes place within a vast background of cultural presuppositions. Today it is clear that the experiential realism paradigm of biological fundamentalism promoted by Lakoff and Johnson is losing traction and followers within cognitive linguistics. At the same time, research groups working on the cutting edges of distributed cognition, embodiment, intersubjectivity, and in activism have rejected the between-the-ears orientation and brain-centered focus on cognition. They are now exploring the complex interactions between body, mind, and world with increasing emphasis on the world, interaction, and language, and most especially on developing tools to explore what they call social neuroscience and social cognition. In short, they are embracing positions that resonate with what is going on in cultural linguistics. In 2007, Gottlieb provided this cogent insight. What Lakoff calls the contemporary theory of metaphor grew up in a particular historical context, among linguists heavily influenced by, though ultimately distancing themselves from the Chomskyan notions of language. However, two aspects of Chomsky's theory seem to have been inherited: the emphasis on linguistic universals, or universal grammar, and the notion that language is an innate, cognitively determined faculty. Though for Chomsky's mental faculty, Lakoff and his followers substitute the biological. If you're not familiar with Gottlieb's work, there is work called Washing the Mind. It's really a remarkable and very underestimated piece of research. I'd highly recommend it for anyone working in cultural linguistics. Okay. Peter Harder, writing in 2010, wrote the following: the emphasis within cognitive linguistics on bodily grounding means that the internalist perspective is generally given priority as a source of explanation. In this, there's a continuity with first-generation cognitive science. Again, we're back. Lakoff and Johnson outline a picture of cognitive architecture which accords with the rule of thumb among cognitive scientists stating that 95% of all thought is inaccessible to consciousness. Our unconscious conceptual knowledge functions like a hidden hand that shapes how we conceptualize all aspects of our experience. Chomsky is generously said to deserve enormous credit, Lakoff and Johnson, 1999, for bringing into linguistics the notion of unconscious cognitive structures. In this picture, the explanatory status of tacit knowledge thus survived from Chomsky to cognitive linguistics, while the specification of what it consists of radically changed. Already in the year 2000, we find discussion showing up in print concerning the model of experiential realism as proposed by Lakoff and Johnson in the hardened form. Right? This quote comes from a book called Pragmatism and Cognition. Given the commitment of experiential realism to an account of mind that is neurally realistic, concepts and meaning are considered to be embodied. Embodiment of meaning specifically implies that the same neural and cognitive mechanisms that are responsible for perception and sensory motor control also create our conceptual systems and modes of reasons via processes of neural co-activation. Indeed, for those working in cognitive linguistics, second-generation cognitive science appeared to bring with it a shift from seeing the mind as a disembodied manipulation of formal symbols and of language, as a syntactic arrangement of formal symbols, accessed unconsciously algorithms that reflected language universals, to seeing the mind as embodied, and that language exploits universal features of human perception and bodily structure, which are then reflected in language usage. Rather than formal symbols linking representations to a pre-given world, focus in the Lakovian model has been on metaphor and transformations of basic neural structures accessed unconsciously as they come to manifest themselves in conceptual metaphors. According to Johnson and Lakoff in their 2002 article entitled Why Cognitive Linguistics Requires Embodied Realism, they state, representation is a term we carefully try to avoid, since it calls up an idealized cognitive model of mind with disembodied internal idea objects that can somehow correspond to states of affairs in the external world. According, in contrast, to our experientialist view, neither image schemas nor any other aspect of conceptual structure are representations in this sense. That is, they are not supposed to be viewed as disembodied internal idea objects. Instead, you were to believe that they are image schemas, and that an image schema is, quote, a neural structure residing somewhere, residing in the sensory motor system that allows us to make sense of what we experience. I mean, to me, these still seem to be pretty disembodied notions. Okay. It is clear that there's been a universal acceptance of the term conceptual metaphor theory, and that the term has been changing in its meaning. As if the phrase conceptual metaphor used in the term needed no further justification. But I continue to believe that we're actually talking more about a theory of conceptualization rather than a theory of metaphor. Pawelek seems to agree. The definitions of conceptual metaphor that Lakoff and Johnson offer do not cover metaphorical phenomena. Conceptual metaphor theory should be understood primarily as a highly speculative, empiricist theory of meaning extension rather than a theory of metaphor. Conceptual metaphor theory treats everything that does not belong to the sensory motor experience as metaphorical and relies primarily on generic cognitive characteristics of human beings, making it insensitive to the crucial role of historical, social, cultural situatedness of language, and hence the role of cultural conceptualizations. What we find in recent years are attempts to escape from embodied realism, this is my view, while clinging desperately to its basic premise. Some 30 years after Metaphors We Live By, we are hearing increasing murmurs of dissent and talk of a social cognitive linguistics. What I call the social term can be understood as a new operation of the same kind. Language and conceptualization needs to be set in the wider context of meaning in society. In classic cognitive linguistics, the central form of grounding is bodily grounding. This dimension retains its crucial role. He's not ready to walk away from it yet. But in social cognitive linguistics, grounding also includes the anchoring of meaning and feedback from the environment outside the individual's body. Okay, at this point we'll look at some kind of a summary of differences that exist between cultural linguistics and cognitive linguistics, most of which you already know. First of all, you have in cultural linguistics emphasis on social cultural situatedness of language and situated embodiment, Jordan Zlatov's term. In contrast, you still have a clinging to the notion of embodied realism, biological neural embodiment. On the left, we find language viewed as deeply entrenched in group-level cultural and the cultural cognition of communities of speakers. In cognitive linguistics, you still have an emphasis on linguistic mentalism, the role of the cognitive unconscious. For cultural linguistics, we have a methodological distributed cognition, wideware. On the other hand, we have methodological individualism and a focus between the ears. Cultural linguistics foregrounds explorations of cultural conceptualizations, the lingua-cultural nexus, cultural schemas, cultural categories, cultural cognitive models, cultural structuring with scenes or scenarios or scripts. Cognitive linguistics, on the other hand, foregrounds universal cognitive processes such as figure-ground relations, force dynamics, emergent categories, and idealized cognitive models. For cultural linguistics, we have the cultural aspects of conceptualization and their role in language, which play a central role in investigations. Again, a lingua-cultural focus. In cognitive linguistics, cultural aspects of conceptualization are relegated to the margins, often portrayed as non-basic, secondary levels of concern, or simply left unlabeled. Cultural linguistics, I believe, has an increasingly stronger emphasis on diachronic studies, situating things historically, looking at the diachronic axis of the data, whereas you find in cognitive linguistics in general a strong synchronic orientation. We have in cultural linguistics an emphasis on world Englishes and other languages outside Anglo-American English. Cognitive linguistics has this linguocentristic focus that Enrique Bernardes has talked about, and Gary Palmer has also pointed out as being a very detrimental feature of cognitive linguistics. And I would also just point out that we stop and think about what happened with Chomsky and linguistics. It too started out focused on English, continues to be focused on English, and if you're working with a language which is outside English or outside the Indo-European languages, you have to make your language comply with the English model that has been set up. For cultural linguistics, we have a multidisciplinary focus, and I think this is very, very important, that language is viewed as a complex adaptive system with links to dynamic systems and complexity sciences. Cultural linguistics is truly open to the cognitive sciences. In the case of cognitive linguistics, I believe that it really lacks a multidisciplinary focus. Okay. For years, a tug-of-war has been going on inside cognitive linguistics with increasing intensity, focused on competing definitions of key terms. A tug-of-war that's certainly not new is the title of the following talk by Raymond Gibbs at the International Cognitive Linguistics Conference celebrated in 1997 in Amsterdam demonstrates. The name of his talk was Taking Metaphor Out of Our Heads and Putting It into the Cultural World. Then, in 2013, 15 years later, he comes back and writes, Why do some people dislike conceptual metaphor theory? It's a very interesting article, by the way. That entire issue is something that you should take a look at. This from the Journal of Cognitive Semiotics. There are some very, very interesting articles in that special issue. In the past decade, dozens of similar articles have appeared in print, which could be cited, many of them written by leading lights in cognitive linguistics, some of whom are with us today here in Prato. And the battle is bound to continue over this universalist, body-oriented, and grounded individualist stance toward cognition and the appropriateness of solely foregrounding universal processes. We see that this mentalistic stance found in cognitive linguistics contrasts with the framework of distributed and extended cognition intrinsic to cultural linguistics. A process is not cognitive simply because it happens in the brain, nor is a process non-cognitive simply because it happens in the interaction among many brains. Yet after several decades of heated discussion, cognition, along with cognitive, continues to be a little understood term, never fully defined, yet omnipresent in cognitive linguistics. Embodiment, in turn, is another one of those terms, ever popular, yet inherently opaque, a term that has so many definitions that one becomes dizzy trying to sort them out. And when one leaves the relatively safe confines of cognitive linguistics and moves into the thickets of cognitive science, the problems only increase. The definitions one runs into are not only different, but often contradictory. In sum, over the past 30 years, much time and energy has been expended defending the model of embodied realism, as well as attempting to escape from it. Cultural linguistics, on the other hand, represents, in my opinion, a clean break where the core tenets of cognitive linguistics discussed in this talk no longer need to be defended. In 2006, in an article called "When Will Cognitive Linguistics Become Cultural?", Gary Palmer wrote, "In my view, culture and cognition are not separate entities, just two views on the process whereby people with minds, which are embedded in physical bodies, situated in social physical environments, communicate, learn, think, and pursue social goals." Similarly, Edwin Hutchins proposed an integrated view of human cognition, in which a major component of culture is a cognitive process, and cognition is a cultural process. At this point, it's hard to tell whether or when the pro-cultural forces in cognitive linguistics will finally succeed in reorienting that field. What I can say, however, is that cultural linguistics, with its culturally oriented theoretical and methodological approach, represents a very attractive option for them. Even though cultural linguistics views cultural conceptualizations as shared, there's still a tendency for us to see culture as out there in the world. So I'd like to close this part of the talk by citing a recent article by Blount from 2014 entitled "Situating Cultural Models in History and Cognition." In it, Blount speaks about out-of-awareness brain functions and cultural cognitive models. Most of the brain's functions are out of awareness, that the conscious aware aspects constitute only a small part of the brain's work regarding behavior. Cultural cognitive models are one part of a framework within which information is stored, organized, and activated. They too operate mostly out of awareness and can be seen as one of the cognitive systems. Thus, according to Blount, cultural cognitive models can be viewed as neural models in terms of mental storage, retrieval, out of awareness, long-term and short-term memory, and association with other forms of neurally stored encyclopedic knowledge. Cultural linguistics is on track with the current thinking in other fields of cognitive science. Our knowledge of the workings of the human mind increases day by day, and so does our understanding of the extended, distributed, embodied, and culturally mediated character of the human mind. And so does, we might add, our understanding of language itself. I'll now turn to a few challenges and suggestions that some of which I've heard from other speakers at the conference. First, I believe that there's a need for the recognition and exploration of the role of ritual and traditional social practices and beliefs as important vehicles for the transmission of cultural linguistic artifacts across time and generations, how the former can contribute to the stability of the latter. I think there's a need to encourage the exploration of how material artifacts or sets of material artifacts can act as anchors for cultural conceptualizations and aid in their transmission across both space and time. All this requires an integration of ethnographic-oriented approaches, something that Gary Palmer has talked about, and the recognition that the entrenchment, stability, and survival of many cultural conceptualizations are linked inextricably to a matrix of practices, beliefs, and material objects. There's a need for a search for cultural schemas, and again I'm following something that Gary Palmer wrote, that are grammatically inscribed in the language and that are congruent with certain social practices. This is really the challenge of one of the challenges faced by cultural linguistics. Some of these grammatically inscribed schemas might fall into the category of Worf's cryptotypes, cultural norms and their linguistic counterparts that pass unnoticed by speakers and consequently are part of the unreflected cultural linguistic usage. For all of us, but most especially those working with non-Indo-European languages or standard average European languages, the search for cryptotypes can include uncovering cultural words or cultural words, which are cultural keywords, specific cultural conceptualization of the world that are peculiar to a given cultural community and linked to a unique worldview. Such cultural words are usually ubiquitous, very much entrenched in culture, and very often very difficult to explain and translate into other languages. As such, they can represent deeply backgrounded cultural conceptualizations. The challenge lies in discovering them. I believe that there should be more emphasis on diachronic studies, historical comparative approaches, more research of an evolutionary and ethno-linguistic nature, including forays into human and non-human animal interaction and intercommunication, which is my latest passion. Is I make a little self-promo. There's an article coming out in Farsad's new book that I wrote, which is about parrots. And its subtitle is Taking Parrots Seriously. It's a fun article. Okay. We still need to develop a robust ontological and philosophical grounding for the field of cultural linguistics. We need to refine existing instruments of analysis and terminology, things like cultural cognitive models. What exactly do we mean by these terms? I would like also to encourage engagement with terminology and concepts being developed in adjacent fields, such as distributed cognition, extended mind, enaction, intersubjectivity, radical embodied cognition, that in turn impact our work in cultural linguistics and actually form part of the basic tenets of cultural linguistics. And remember, these are very hot button items in in cognitive science today. This is really the cutting edge. And the way that Farsad has put together sort of the basic tenets of cultural linguistics, we are there, okay? But I think many people don't know that yet. Okay, I hope, therefore, that we can gain a greater awareness of the way that research paradigms in cognitive science and cultural linguistics are coming together. That both cognition and language are increasingly viewed through the lens of the 4 E's, as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, a movement referred to collectively as the new wave in cognitive science. I would like to see us promote the for more engagement, right? And cross-disciplinary collaboration with researchers working on these new wave 4 E's, those approaches to cognition and language. And as a side, several of us are already doing this. Okay, final part. I just want to point out a few things that I think we might keep in mind as we try to further develop the field. Currently, there are 283 of us, the last time I checked anyway, signed on as followers in the Cultural Linguistics Research Interest Group on Academia EDU. How many people here know Academia? We still have some people to convert. Okay. If you don't know what it is, send me an email. There are what, 24 million? How many million are on academia? Anybody remember? 24, 25, 30 million? I find it an absolutely amazing place to post articles, to get in contact with other scholars, to keep on top of what's going on. So I think that we really should exploit it to the full extent. Colleagues should be encouraged to join the group of the Cognitive Linguistics Research Interest Group, which is on Academia EDU. You can go in and you can see who's there and what's going on. And then when you sign up, you get notifications when they post something, when they post one of their articles. And then colleagues should be encouraged to join, not only join the group, but to be sure that their papers are tagged with our interest group, right? At the same time, I'd really encourage us to bookmark the papers that come out of our colleagues. This helps others get to see what we are doing. It's a way of promoting the field. Then, where appropriate, colleagues in adjacent fields should be encouraged to add the tag cultural linguistics to their own articles. Currently, we have a book series and a journal, and we've started a conference series, so what else is missing? Given the interdisciplinary focus of cultural linguistics, it's easy to miss an article of importance concerning what's going on in related areas of cognitive science, cognitive anthropology, etc. So is there a need for a cultural linguistic listserv? Or is there some way that we can consider having a way to post suggestions for readings for people, for researchers in cultural linguistics? Perhaps a Facebook page and other suggestions maybe that you've got. That's it.